Bill, James, I'm very excited for this interview. Before we dive into the questions, for everyone listening, Bill, James, could you give a brief introduction of your career up until this point? And let's start, Bill, could you go first?
I'm Bill Fernandez. I'm known for having introduced Steve Wozniak to Steve Jobs, and I was the first person they hired after they started Apple.
My name is James Cape. I was born and raised in Silicon Valley with a brief stop in San Diego. Spent 18 years at Intel and a total of 35 in tech as an executive, and retired in 2015.
And we met because our dads knew each other.
Our dads played war games, miniature war games together.
In my dad's garage.
In his dad's garage.
With little toy soldiers.
Yep, and sometimes in our garage.
Well, let's start right there. You've been in Silicon Valley since the early days, which I'm guessing that if you were to arrive in Silicon Valley right now, it'd be completely different, day and night. What was Silicon Valley like back then, playing war games in garages, or parents getting together, working on projects? What was it like?
Oh, Bill, you go ahead and kick that off.
All right.
You're the senior member here.
All right. Well, our family moved into Sunnyvale when I was about 5, and we moved into a small tract of houses that was made primarily for Lockheed engineers. So we had a lot of Lockheed employees on our little street, and that's where we all raised our families together, or where our parents raised their families. When we first moved in, there was a school behind us, and there was our little tract of houses, and then for miles around was apricot orchards. And all the roads leading away from that little tract were 2-lane roads with no sidewalks and orchards along the sides. And little by little, over the years, those orchards were replaced by houses and schools and other buildings, and we got sidewalks and gutters and everything. And now, after many years, it's completely different.
Yeah, I remember the same thing. We used to play in orchards in Mountain View and Los Altos, and we used to hunt each other in the springtime with our wrist rockets and green apricots and trash can lids, and we had wars.
Exactly, yeah.
And we also used to pull up the yellow mustard dirt clods and throw them at each other.
Yes.
So we grew up, and basically this place was called Valley of Heart's Delight until 1971, when the term Silicon Valley came about. But as we grew up as kids, we were in that transition from agriculture to sand.
There was no silicon in Silicon Valley when we were kids.
Yes.
Wait, how do you go from wrist rockets, throwing
dirt clods
at each other, to forming companies in people's garages?
Well, you grow up. That's part of it, of course.
Well, it's our dads were tinkerers. They're engineers, right? And we were all sons and daughters, by and large, of middle-class engineers, right? And so tinkering and playing with things and figuring out how things work is just part of the psychology. And it maps well into the history of the Valley, when HP was formed in the 30s, right? What is it, 33?
Whenever.
Yeah, whenever.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, it was something like 1933. They've got the Packard garage still is a state historic monument now. And so that ethos of tinkering and playing with things, with technology, playing games, it was just what our families did, right? And it kind of laid the groundwork for kind of the ethos. It was okay to take risks and gamble on new ideas, and to constantly be experimenting and iterating new ideas about great things. My dad had a project in our garage that was absolutely going to change the world of moving caustic materials in a semiconductor fab, but it never went anywhere. But Apple did.
There was a very long build-up to technology, from the orchards to the technology. Okay, there was Varian up north of Sunnyvale who developed klystron tubes, which eventually became the tubes that are the core of microwave ovens. But at that time, I think they were used in radars. And then there was Ampex, which made high-end magnetic recorders for broadcast audio and video and so forth. Eventually, Fairchild came and moved in and started building integrated circuits there. And from Fairchild, a lot of people split off to do other semiconductor companies. So we had Siliconics, which I worked at, but no one has heard of.
Nope, I haven't heard of it.
And we had Intersil, and we had Shockley, and we had Signetics, and so forth. So all of these spin-offs, and then the spin-offs had lots of technology people, and the technology people wanted technology stores, places to get metal or printed circuit boards. Little shops came up where you could go and say, you know, I need a case bent up out of metal and holes punched in it so I could mount my parts in there and make my device. And you know, I need these kind of materials, or I want a surplus store where I can go and shop for things for my hobbies. Or so there were both professional and amateur-oriented services building up as part of the ecosystem. And it built up over many, many years, from being agricultural and having fields and farmers and farms to being more technology-based. And I grew up on a street of Lockheed engineers, and sometimes in retrospect, I wish I'd grown up on a street of cabinet makers, because I love working with wood and I love crafting beautiful things out of wood. I'm not good at it, but I love the feel of that. And yet I grew up on a street of engineers, and electronics was kind of in the air. So I ended up doing electronic engineering rather than building cabinets, because that's the people and the parts and the knowledge that was, you know, surrounding me.
And you did it in the garage.
Yeah, I did it in the garage.
Did it in the garage.
Yeah, there was nowhere else.
Yeah, there's nowhere else to do
I did a little bit
it.
in my bedroom, and then my parents kicked me out.
Yeah, yeah. Our garage, Bill, half of it, you may not remember it, but half of it was a woodworking shop and an auto shop, right? And I used to lube points, rebuild carburetors, change transaxles. And the other part of it was where your dad would come over, and that was the wargaming room. Now, Bill's dad's wargaming room was a huge family room. You guys had the best place to play miniature war games.
Yeah, he eventually got kicked out of the house into the garage, too.
So
half of the garage, we had a wall kind of down the middle. Half of the garage was his wargaming room, and the other half was laundry and storage, but a little tiny part. My parents were really nice, and they set up a workbench for me with power and lights, so I could do my projects out there rather than on my desk in my bedroom.
But you're gonna have to tell me, what is this war gaming room? What is war? I'm picturing miniature action figures.
Before Dungeons and Dragons, people used to take little figurines molded out of typically lead, and they would paint them up and put a bunch of them on a little stand. So now you have a platoon, and it could be a platoon of Roman soldiers or World War II soldiers or Napoleonic soldiers, all painted up to look like they were in uniform. And you could have the cannons or the artillery or whatever, and they would make a big board out of plywood. My dad painted his, he's got some example soldiers here.
yeah, these literally are the toys. This is my father's.
That's Napoleonic.
Yeah, these are Napoleonic.
Yeah.
And so Bill's dad would have all the engineers over and say, let's reenact the water of Waterloo.
Yeah.
And literally they'd put the
Your little
whole battlefield of Waterloo up on a strategic map, and then they would move armies around with little push pins.
Yeah.
And then once they got close enough together, you'd figure out where to put these figures down, and then you'd fight the tactical portion of the game.
Yeah.
And again, this maps into engineering ethos, right? Experimentation, arguments among peers about what the historical strength is of French grenadiers, right? You know, I actually knew this, but I don't think you played them as much as I did.
No.
I loved them. I started playing them when I was about 6, 7 years old.
So my dad had a big board where he took several pieces of plywood, 4 feet by 8 foot pieces of plywood, and stuck them together, painted it all, I think, in green chalkboard paint, and then painted a grid on it, and then had little pieces of plywood cut out to be little hills. And he could use chalk to chalk out, here are the rivers, and here are the roads, and here's basically the terrain for a battle that we're going to fight. And it could, again, it could be Roman era, it could be Napoleonic era, it could be World War II era. And he would set up the rules for how far can this unit move over good soil? How far can it move in a turn on the roads and so forth? How far can it shoot? If it's a sharpshooting platoon, if they shoot at those guys at this distance, like, you know, measured like 12 inches over, which represents some distance in real life, how accurately could they hit the thing they're shooting at? And if they're not elites, then how accurately accurate would that be, and so forth. And there was a bunch of men who would come and they would play to all of these rules. And this was before Dungeons and Dragons. So it's very similar to Dungeons and Dragons in that you have simulations, you have strengths and weaknesses, you have rules, you can accumulate or decrement your health or your vitality, or you can get sick or whatever. Some were better at one thing and some were better at others. You'd have the dragoons, you'd have the pikemen, you would have the sharpshooters, you'd have the artillery, again, depending upon the era. Okay, and then they would sort of play out, then each man would have their own battalion or group of soldiers they were responsible for, and they'd use their brains and say, okay, well, if I did this, could I win this battle against those guys? And sometimes they would have recreate mock battles, or based upon just a scenario that Dad thought up. And sometimes they would try to reenact, say, the Battle of Waterloo or other famous battles, by setting up the terrain to look like that. Okay, so this is very much like Dungeons and Dragons, but with little figurines and down on paper.
Wow. I'm just wondering, as you're explaining this, how much of that spills over to either the business world or creating product, or just the strategic processes that were going on in the garage there? How did that correlate to starting companies and building ideas?
Well, I'm going to answer a different question. So Jerry Wozniak was one of my dad's wargaming buddies, and part of wargaming is a random element, and they used to roll dice, okay, to see what is the random number that's going to control this. And Jerry Wozniak built this box. It was about this wide and about this tall, maybe this deep, painted it green, and it had 2 rows of lights on it and a button, and it would plug in. And every time he pushed the button, the lights would randomly select. So you would get a number between 0 and 99. Okay, and so rather than having 2 dice, so you could get 6 variations, now you could have like 99. And this was his random number generator that could be used each turn to say, okay, what's the random number that affects, did you kill those guys, or did this happen, or did this happen? Okay, and then he asked me to test it like 1,000,000 times to see if it really was random. And I declined because I was just a kid and that would be boring.
Yeah, my dad actually bought one of them because my dad had on the mainframe computer at Varian where he was working at in Palo Alto, he had that big mainframe calculate probabilities of kills based on several sets of parameters. And you asked about the correlation to kind of startup culture of the Valley. This is right kind of at the early phases of startup culture. When you think about it, the engineers, our dads got together in groups. They would debate the strategic board, right? They would go off and they'd say, how are we going to do things? So we think about it as having 2 startup teams and sometimes we used to play over days. Like Bill's dad would have Jerry over, my dad
They'd
over.
have campaigns.
They would have
days.
campaigns. It would take several weeks to play it out. But you essentially had 2 startup teams competing. And if you think about the culture of Silicon Valley around experimentation, taking risk, being willing to accept failure, gathering lots of extra data, this is what our fathers did. And so I did it more than Bill did, but it just seeped into my being about this is how you need to first strategically think about a problem, how you need to think about who you're going to war with, right? Business is war by other means, right? And then how are you going to execute it strategically? And then how are you going to execute it tactically? And that, in all the years I spent at Intel and in tech, that thought process for me is just integral to the way I think. Without even thinking, I do that in my head without even thinking about it.
Now you had asked, how does wargaming lead into startups and so forth? And I'm going to answer that 2 ways. One is, my dad was a lawyer, not an engineer. One of the key people who was a part of his group of wargamers was an auto mechanic. Okay, there was also a very high-class engineer, Jerry Wozniak, who worked at Lockheed. And there were several other people, like his father, James Cape, who was kind of like in the middle of the technology levels, as I understand it.
Yeah, he was middle-class engineer.
But not everybody was technology-oriented. Okay, so that it was something that was of interest to a wide variety of professionals and non-professionals. Second answer I'll give you about how wargaming helps people with startups is you learn strategy, and you learned tactics, And you learned that there are rules to every game, and there are parameters to every scenario, and that there are risks, and that you will craft you will adopt a strategy, you will craft a tactic, you will try that tactic, you'll see how it works, and then you'll pivot and you'll change. And generally change tactics to try to use your strategy to win whatever objectives are. So all of that thinking is really good training, I think, for starting up companies.
Do you think that was the foundation, or was there any other components that really made Silicon Valley as fertile of a ground for startups? Any other firsts that were here or ideas that were here that really fostered or opened doors for innovation?
Well, yes. I mean, the things that made Silicon Valley possible are broad, and we just spent a little bit of time talking about something very narrow, which was my dad's garage and his wargaming buddies, okay? So let's move out into what made Silicon Valley possible, okay? Freedom of thought. Remember, the people who started Fairchild, as I understand it, they came from the East, where everything was very rigid about how you did business, how you behaved, and so forth. They relocated to California and built a company saying, we're going to do our stuff our way. And everybody said, we're going to do our stuff our way. We're going to do what we want to do the way we want to do it, and we have the freedom to do it. We don't have to do it the way those guys say business has to be done. Okay? Another thing is that everybody was inventing things. Everybody was creating things. So the people who came here and started up technology businesses were the people who wanted to build things, to create things, to invent things, all technology things. I mean, they weren't creating furniture or fashion or agriculture. They were all doing technology. And electronics technology. Electronics technology was a wonderful developing area where there were infinite possibilities. So anybody who had a talent or an interest in electronics and wanted to be creative, again, were drawn out here. Another thing is, as things built, as one company built and another company built, you would end up having lots of technology people in the employment pool, and you would have a lot of technology support companies around. You would have suppliers of various kinds. You would have shops that could fabricate things for you, could fabricate a printed circuit board, could fabricate a metal case, and so forth. You had parts suppliers to supply parts for the things that people wanted to do. And so little by little, the variety and the depth and maturity of all of these different things increased over the years.
Yeah, and from my perspective, Sean, it kind of starts, I come from the integrated circuit world, from the semiconductor world, right? I ended up joining Intel in '83. Intel had already been, it became a first venture-backed startup in history in 1968 when Arthur Rock put in $2 million and Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce put in $500,000 each. Right, and that is truly the first example of a startup. What did that lead to? Well, everyone got stock options. Right, that's one reason Noyce and Grove left Fairchild, because Fairchild's management, again to Bill's reference, it was an East Coast company, and they believed that stock options were only for the executive staff. That is not how Gordon and Robert looked at it. And by the way, it wasn't just because they wanted to share ownership capitalism. They also realized that if they paid an engineer $50,000 a year, they could talk them into taking $20,000 of that 50 in stock options, right? And so when you had Intel in the semiconductor industry, if you go back to Shockley, was it 56, something in and around there? The creation of the integrated circuit allowed semiconductors to be created, and then people like Bill and Steve Woz could go down to Hamilton Avnet, which I think was that was your distributor down in
Sunnyvale Electronics,
or or the Homebrew Club, and go share piece parts. Yeah. You go figure out what your bag of parts was that Bill and Steve wanted to go. Okay, we want to build the blue box, which apparently was actually gray.
Yes,
right, was gray.
The blue box was
gray.
It was gray. Blue box was gray.
His blue box was gray.
What's the blue box?
It was a way of
we'll talk about that a little bit later. Yeah.
Ripping off AT&T for long-distance phone calls.
Yeah.
My uncle bought one and was chased for 2 years by the FBI.
Yeah. So let's continue for a little bit with the what makes Silicon Valley possible. Okay, and then we can get onto blue boxes.
Yeah, it leads, okay, ownership capitalism to me is the second one. And again, people will debate this. And the last thing, and Bill said it allows for, it creates highly adaptive human networks. Because as Bill references, it's not just groups of engineers that get together and say, hey, look, there's a new opportunity, a new company over here. I want to leave Ampex, I want to go do something new. Right? I want to leave Varian, I want to go do something new. But it began to create an ecosystem of vendors. And everyone in Silicon Valley talks today about, I want to be a platform company. The concept of platform is actually at the core of what Silicon Valley is as a place that people create technology and do business. Right? Core smart teams that have groups of people around them, both talent as well as vendors that are able to feed their dreams, of which Woz and Bill were able to take advantage of.
Over the evolution of Silicon Valley, each stage of development has enabled things that weren't possible before. So for example, when the first technology companies like Varian or Ampex or Fairchild moved into the south part of the San Francisco Bay Area, it became possible to have a technology job in a nice place that wasn't, back east, Boston or whatever. And as multiple companies in similar industries, Varian was making vacuum tubes, and Fairchild was making integrated circuits, and Ampex was making magnetic tape drives. Okay, so as more and more companies of similar types built, then it became possible to move from one company to another if you weren't happy with one or if someone wanted to hire you. And as an ecosystem of fabrication shops built up, it became possible for people who wanted to build their own products, either as hobbies or mostly as a small startup to make my own company. I want to make an audio mixer and sell 50 a year to people. I need someone who can bend up sheet metal, I need someone who can make a printed circuit board, I need an assembly house, I need parts and stuff. It became possible to build little home businesses because the ecosystem was there. The shops were there, the fabricators, the supply shops, and so forth. And that's what really enabled Apple to start, is that was in place before we came on the scene, if you will. So each time, you could think of plateaus of development, of the evolution of the environment. At various inflection points, it became possible to do more things. Now, it's still not possible to make products like the iPhone in Silicon Valley because we don't have the manufacturing facilities, we don't have the supply chains to get all the parts. There's a lot of things that we don't have in Silicon Valley that would support mass manufacturing. The only mass manufacturing I know we have is the Tesla plant making cars. Yeah. Okay, so we can do other things in Silicon Valley, but we haven't developed a manufacturing ecosystem here.
Yeah, and I think that, Sean, that you look at kind of the evolution, and what Bill's referring to is, you start with HP, you move on to Shockley Fairchild, you go to Intel, then to Apple, then Netscape with Jim Clark and Mark Andreessen, right? Mm-hmm. And you think about what was the first true killer app for the PC besides what the Apple team did around writing and fonts and things like that. It became the World Wide Web. Mm-hmm. And when that happened, Netscape went public in August of 1995. And I remember things in this valley truly changed. The engineering culture began to shift to a financial culture. And so now venture capital is really on a tear. New York and Wall Street investment bankers and hedge funds suddenly realized that in Silicon Valley we created a money printing machine, and it moved from real physical engineering to what I call financial engineering. And then this dearth of the ability to actually build stuff here rapidly begins to go away, right? Because then we begin to outsource manufacturing to other places. We manufacturing out first to people like J-Bill, which was a contract manufacturer in Florida. That ends up being in Taipei, right? Soon after that. And by the way, I remember when this began to happen. I was probably 10, 1970. Where a family friend who worked at National, and we knew that Intel did this as well, moved their assembly and test plants to Manila and to Malaysia. Right, and so this trend, this trend of Silicon Valley, once the engine really began to fire, to look to the east, to look to Asia as, hey, this is cheaper to do it over there. I mean, this has a very, very long history, right? I'm 66, 1970. You can do the math, right? I mean, you could see it happen. But I remember when Netscape went public with the biggest single one-day pop in history at the time. Things changed.
Now, it used to be very easy to build hardware here. That's in part because the kind of hardware that was being built was pretty basic, pretty trivial, pretty old-fashioned now. You could take a little circuit board, you could put some parts in it, you could flip it over, you could hand solder it, you could flip it back, you could screw it down inside a box, you could close up the box and have some holes with some parts and some controls on it, and you could have a shippable product. No one in this day and age is going to buy a little folded metal box with things sticking out the front, okay? Except in very specialist places where they're only going to buy like 20 of them, as the lifetime of the product. Nowadays, everything has to be built to a very high level, okay? And you can't do that in your house anymore. You can't do that in your garage anymore. So being able to enter into an industry, to build a business like Apple did, back in that age where it was still okay. And our first product was just a printed circuit board. No power supply, no case, no keyboard, no screen. It was just the printed circuit board, okay? You can't sell products like that anymore, okay? And then if you wanted to try to, in Silicon Valley, design and build a hardware product, it's really, really hard. It's very expensive, and you need a company to do that. You can't do that in your house really anymore. However, software is cheap and easy. There are billions of people around the world, not only in Silicon Valley, but in Georgia, in Florida, in Estonia, and Romania, who are sitting in their homes at a computer, programming stuff, and putting it up on the internet. It's really easy, relatively speaking, and it's still possible for people to create a new product on the web out of software, okay? But if they want to make a new product out of hardware and then sell it through distribution, then it's really hard. So that's a huge shift from here in the Silicon Valley area.
Let's go back to speaking of changes in Silicon Valley over time. Can you give us insight on what it looked like? Because at the very beginning you mentioned you were the one that introduced Wozniak to Steve Jobs. What was the culture, the atmosphere, those early days of Apple working in a garage?
Well, a lot of people like to think about things they think of pivotal events, like working in the garage, and that's not necessarily where Silicon Valley came from. Okay. One of the things I haven't mentioned yet, which I think is critically important about what makes Silicon Valley possible and what made Apple and everything else possible, was the generosity of the engineers. Electronic engineers, at least, were the people I hung out with, were very generous with their time, with their help, with their mentorship. I was mentored by 2 or 3 different people on my street who were the dads of kids, okay? I remember that I met this guy who was an engineer at at Hewlett Packard, and I said, I don't have any money and I'm trying to make electronics projects and sort of teach myself electronics. And there was a place where Hewlett Packard had this little warehouse of rejects and things and excess parts and components that could be given to charity, and they got a tax write-off whenever they made a charitable donation. You could just go and grab some handfuls of stuff and bag it up and bring it over to me. When Woz and I built what's been known as the cream soda computer, where that came from is he was able to call up application engineers at various companies and say, I'm a student, I'm trying to learn electronics, do you have any parts that you could give me? And Signetics gave us, an application engineer reached into a bin of reject parts, and they had like these 55-gallon drums, so they were cardboard drums of reject parts. He just pulled out, a double handful and said, here. And he went to Monsanto, which was at that time one of the pioneers in making LED devices. And we got a little handful of LEDs. And he went to Intersil, which was an early manufacturer of bipolar RAM chips. And they gave him very expensive, 8 little bipolar RAM chips, 256 bits. So you put 8 of them together, you got 256 bytes. And we put those together in my garage to build the cream soda computer. Generosity from Monsanto engineers, generosity from Signetics engineers, generosity from an Intel engineer, generosity from Steve Wozniak's dad, who would answer questions and mentor me, from Ed Giles, my brother's best friend's father, who lived at the end of the block, who would give me old electronic surplus gear from the military days, and I'd tear them apart, and then I would have parts I could use to build new projects and stuff. Bert, forget his last name, but he was the HP engineer who went to their charity warehouse and grabbed me a bunch of stuff. When I was working at Hewlett-Packard or at Apple, and I'd say, like George Crow, I was at Apple, and I said, I want to build this little flyback circuit to make a high voltage thing so I could have a Jacob's ladder where the little spark goes bzzz, okay? And how do I do this? And he sketched out the circuitry and told me how it worked, and I was able to build it. So those are examples of how the generosity as an ethos was, I think, a real part of the enablement of wide numbers of people throughout the valley to grow and to experiment and to become successful in their own rights.
Yeah, Sean, to build on that, you interviewed Ron Whittier with me, who was a very early Intel employee and was a protege of Andy Grove's. He was also responsible for literally creating Intel Oregon, which is now the biggest employer in the state of Oregon. And Ron, one of the things when you and I talked to him, talked about the importance of talent, of sharing, and of being both a student and a teacher, right? And that is something that Andy Grove used to, when I joined in '83, just drilled into our heads. At any moment, you could be either a teacher or a student. And it was absolutely expected. And that really is part of engineering culture. It's like, we're trying to invent something. It's hard, it's complicated, right? I need help. I don't have all the answers, right? And so I need to go find other smart people who are within my network. And again, go back to my comment about the power of highly distributed human networks, right? It allowed that to happen in a way that's truly unique. And what's different about my experience compared to Bill's, right, is where I started at Intel, we were the semiconductor part suppliers, right? We were the core ingredient suppliers. Bill and Woz, they were the builders. They were the builders who said, hey, I think a consumer might have this kind of use case for this kind of technology. Let's build that, right? Let's design it and then build it. And then they had an ecosystem here in the Valley at the time for hardware that allowed it to happen. And what happened after '95, right? The only money that any startup could really get, and this is one reason Peter Thiel talks about there hasn't really been any innovation since '95, is because what venture capital went and did is funded essentially 6 code monkeys in a room, right? Because if the startup fails, all you got to do is get out of your lease and confiscate all the laptops, right? Now, with the rise of AI and the importance of massively parallel systems to run these AI chatbots, silicon has now become important again. And something very bad in Silicon Valley happened, kind of unwittingly from my perspective. And it is around the early to mid 90s, you see the rise of fabless semiconductors, which further accelerates what Bill was talking about in terms of the outsourcing of manufacturing. And Morris Chang did a brilliant thing. Morris Chang was CTO of TI, and they weren't going to give him the CEO slot. And he says, well, forget it. I'm going to go back home to Taiwan and get some money from the Taiwanese government, and I'm going to build TSMC. And that's exactly what he did, right? And so unfortunately, the culture, and I really think it goes back to it shifted from an engineering culture to a financial engineering culture. It wasn't focused on great inventions. The famous Robert Noyce quote, "I don't care what you do, just go out and do something wonderful." right? That was his message during one of the three, almost existential deaths of Intel over the early years. And that culture, I hope it kind of comes back. I don't know if it will. It might come back in some other form. But we lost that mojo. We absolutely lost that mojo, because at the end of the day, you got to build physical things, right? So
James comes from the component maker side. I come from the component user side. Yeah. And every time new components came on the market that were affordable and that enabled you to do something more, people would use them in products and do something more. So for example, the iPod, which was this little device that had a 5 megabyte hard disk in it. Okay, this is the age where you had like Walkman and Creative, I forget what their last name was.
Creative Labs?
Creative Labs, they'd have these little MP3 players, okay? Well, finally it was possible to have a little LCD display and a battery that could hold the rechargeable and hold a lot of energy, and a little 5 megabyte hard drive, all in a little tiny case. Those pieces, those components, made it possible to someone to put it together and make a music player that was fun and easy to use and could hold 1,000 tracks. So that couldn't have been done before. So that's an example of how, as technologies develop, which create components that can be used for interesting things, people will build products that do interesting things that couldn't have been done before. And that's a really a core part of the history of consumer technology development, at the very least. Okay.
Yeah, Bill, comment a little bit about, Apple is truly, truly good at designing the bag, understanding what the bag of parts should be, and then designing killer products.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about that kind of early ethos. I'm sorry, I'm stealing your questions.
You're doing good.
Okay.
Okay.
It just seems to me that Apple, of all the companies anywhere on the planet, including Sony, including Samsung, Apple has still a brilliant kind of, and it was very different than Intel. Intel was all PhDs, the early days, PhDs in either electrical engineering or chemistry, right? I think, knowing some of the early people in and around Apple, you had all sorts of people. You had engineers, you had creatives, you had musicians, you had artists. It was a very different, it was an engineering culture, but something more. What was that mojo about? Because that's something that has always fascinated me about Apple as a company.
There are a couple of themes that run through Apple. And as anyone who's looked at Apple history knows, Apple has had its successes, its failures, its ups and downs. But a couple of things we got started with were on, one of the themes was engineering excellence. Do very excellent engineering. Another was make products that matter to people. Empowering ordinary people was always the goal. Whether that be with you can finally have a computer of your own, you can finally have a music player that you love, or whatever it was always about empowering humans, putting the power inherent in technology into the hands of ordinary people, to enable people to fulfill their dreams because you have given them the tools they need, whether their dream is to veg out on music or to build a business. That's another part of it. Another thread was always a high level of design for people. And there's a difference between designing for people and designing for designers. And I think that, for example, the recent liquid glass user interface is designing for designers. And I personally feel that was a really bad move, because it makes it look, from a designer standpoint, beautiful and elegant, but makes it harder to use and harder to understand. Okay. On the other hand, still, despite that misstep, in my opinion, as well as other missteps we've had in the past, there's still this thread of designing for people. Okay, and designing beauty and elegance, and that beauty and elegance, understandability, utility, usability, all matters. Okay. Now, there are also other threads, Apple was one of the first companies I knew of who had a very strong legal department from the beginning. And as an engineer, I thought, well, yeah, you've got to have legal, but you can contract that out, or you could, go hire a person for a couple hours whenever you need some legal help. But we had lawyers on staff from a very early age, okay? And it turns out that legal department has been another pillar, I think, of Apple's success. We also had the thread of always hire the best. Hire the best people at marketing, at creative services, at legal services, at engineering, at distribution, and so forth. And sometimes we've hired the wrong people. Like early on, when we were in our third building, perhaps, Bandley 1, we thought we'd never grow out of Bandley 1 because it was big and spacious. We wanted to go to the next level of our engineering department. And so we hired a high-class, very experienced engineer engineering manager, ex-Hewlett-Packard, who had a brilliant track record at Hewlett-Packard, and he failed at Apple. And I asked Jobs why, and he said, well, it turns out he was really good at managing engineering when he had a tier below him, a lot of people, a lot of helpers, and a lot of people who could interface. So he could be the higher level manager. But we're still at the level where we need a lot of hands-on and direct connection with the engineers. So he didn't have that, and so it didn't work out. Okay? So that was a place where we tried to hire the best that we could find, the best we knew, and it turned out not to be a good match. But that error wasn't enough to make Apple fail. So we had a lot of those. Hire the best, sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. Design for people, design beautifully, make the highest quality products you can, price it so that people could afford it. Do the best, most creative, most excellent, most clever engineering that you can, and so forth. Build a professional company. Both I and Woz and Jobs had all at various times, for various lengths of time, worked at Hewlett-Packard. And Hewlett-Packard had a lot of, for us, very inspirational qualities. The friendliness and camaraderie of people, and the excellence of engineering, and the excellence of documentation and product support and customer service. We knew that electronics products early on, that when you put them into service, if they were going to fail, they would fail within the first month of service. And that if you could catch the early failures by running them in a high temperature environment for a while. That's called burning them in. And then they would fail, and then you would fix them, and then test them again. And then you could ship them knowing that they are very unlikely to fail in service. So one of my first projects in the garage at Apple was to build a burn-in box where we could put a dozen boards in a box and close the lid and run them under power, and they'd get hot and they'd run for some number of days, and a few of them would fail and we'd fix them. But we knew that when we shipped, the product was very unlikely to fail out in the field. And we learned that from Hewlett-Packard. So a lot of those things, we want to be excellent like Hewlett-Packard, not only in one way, but in all the ways you need to be excellent for your company to be successful.
Yeah, you think about Bill's experience. HP as a maker of products that people would buy, whether it was consumer or business or technical, right? The ingredient.
And at that point, Hewlett-Packard was all technology oriented. They were not consumer oriented at that point.
But they eventually got into printers and things like that. But Bill, back in those days, absolutely true. The calculator, I remember my dad bringing home an HP calculator for work, right? And I was amazed. Oh my God, I can multiply, 6-digit numbers together, right? It was incredible. But the semiconductor industry, right? My company, right? Intel, bag of parts, piece part supplier. We were so far abstracted from the user experience. I remember Gordon in a talk when we asked him, someone raised their hand during sales conference, and he goes, well, how do you account for the PC being an amazing thing, of which Apple really did pioneer early PCs? And Gordon says, well, geez, I didn't even know what they could be used for. I thought Betty, my wife, was going to use a PC to organize recipes. And Jobs and Woz and Bill said, oh no, you could do a lot more than that, right? And that's why I think you ought to comment about what the Xerox PARC thing, because that's so much a part of the legend.
You're juxtaposing two things that are like 20 years apart.
I know I am. But at least I know the story, because I recently went to Park and I looked at all the pictures. At least as I know the folk legend is it was you didn't go, but Woz and Jobs went and went. Oh my God, that's a GUI, that's a mouse, that's a GUI, that's a
and
mouse.
Woz didn't go. He wasn't part of that.
Oh, who was it? Just Steve?
Yeah, it was Steve and Bill Atkinson and a few other people. Yeah.
Okay, I thought Woz went, but because that really, that shows that the Apple team, the core Apple team, realized that the user experience was everything. Right. It wasn't a nice to have.
And that was very driven by Jobs. He would not allow us, to the extent that he had control, which varied, over time. He would not allow poor quality products, poorly designed products,
or ugly products,
or ugly products.
No ugly products.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is truly that's Apple is absolutely world class to this. I think still world class to this day, and why I think they're such an important company, right? When you look at the history of the Valley, and as we talked about, it literally layers on top, right? HP, Shockley, Fairchild, Intel, Apple, World Wide Web, Netscape, and then you can take it forward from there, right?
From our consumer design standpoint. I talked about the engineering standpoint and maybe the business, which Hewlett-Packard was our inspiration. But from our consumer design standpoint, Sony was our inspiration. Sony products were beautiful, usable, compact, capable, and so forth. So they were one of our inspirations. Other products like TIAC, Open Reel Tape Decks, and Otari, and Bang & Olufsen. Remember, they had a series of brushed aluminum stereos that were very beautiful. Okay, and so Bang & Olufsen design was another one of our design inspirations. Okay, so we aspired not necessarily to look like Bang & Olufsen or to make our products look like Sony products, but to have the level of excellence and the feel that you get from dealing with those products.
You'd mentioned so many companies that seem to have influenced yourselves growing up. Were there any others that had a big impact that haven't been mentioned so far?
I think for me, Atari. And the reason Atari is because of a personal experience. My best friend in high school, Cobert Smith's dad, knew Nolan Bushnell. And they were both Wildcat. They were both Wildcat entrepreneurs. And over one weekend, Cobert's dad brings us a cassette tape, a color TV, and he helps us interface it to the TV. And the only thing, I remember him saying this, says, well, we're going to go away for the weekend, boys. You guys be good, but play with this, because my friend Nolan wants to know from a kid's perspective, is it this thing called Pong that he's invented? Would you guys drop quarters into it at your local arcade? And we had one. San Antonio and El Camino. It was called the Time Zone. Did you ever go to the Time Zone as a kid?
No, but I remember the name, yeah.
Oh yeah, we used air hockey, pinball, and we would, and finally the Pong gang came out, and there were lines of kids out trying to play it. And anyway, so Cobert and I, over a long weekend between bong rips, doing things we shouldn't do as teenagers in 1976, we were fascinated by it. And the only thing that Cobert's dad asked him, he said, well, what'd you boys think of this game? And would you drop quarters into it at Time Zone? Go, hey man, this is really cool, yeah. So again, that company, and then for years after that, I used to play Atari. Every new Atari game that would come out, we would go to the St. James Infirmary, which was on the other side of Castro, other side of Central, which was kind of sort of the young person Silicon Valley hangout. The old guys and the semiconductor guys used to go to a place called the Wagon Wheel on Middlefield Road. Right, and get in all sorts of trouble because it was almost 90% guys and a handful of, of admins, and there were lawsuits up the wazoo, out of Wagon Wheel. Some of the old Intel guys have told me some of the wild stories at the Wagon Wheel, but we used to go to the St. James Infirmary and drink Long Island iced teas and spend the equivalent of at least $100, $200 on playing all the new Atari video games, dropping quarters into them. So Atari for me, I don't know about you. Atari was really important to me as a kid.
Bill, was there a company for you, or?
I've mentioned a lot of companies that were influential. But I mentioned them all because my memory was sparked by the question you asked. So maybe as further questions emerge, further companies will emerge.
Well, then a question, we've talked a lot about the past, a little about the present. What about the future of Silicon Valley? Where do you see things moving from now in the coming years?
Do we want to talk just about Silicon Valley?
Silicon Valley technology in general, with how you're seeing it went from hardware to software, now AI or whatever you think of in the future, or does it go back to hardware? Does it go to robotics? Where does it go from here?
Go ahead, Bill.
Every interface a user has is with a piece of hardware. Whether it be with a desktop computer, or an all-in-one, or a laptop, or a tablet, or a virtual reality, or maybe in the future we'll have sensors built into your ring and a projector built into your glasses, maybe chips implanted in your brain and so forth. But there will always be a hardware interface to the digital world. We will have, I believe, that the digital world will evolve to be more sophisticated and more immersive. And that doesn't necessarily have to be that I've recreated my street and I do my shopping and I buy ice cream, by visualizing it in a virtual world. It can mean that my spreadsheet is no longer flat. And now that I have a projected space in front of me and can manipulate it with my hands and talk to it, maybe my spreadsheets are 3D. Maybe my word processor is no longer one scrolling thing. Maybe it's something else, has a different shape. Maybe it looks like a stack of things with papers laid out and so forth. So those are examples of how you can be more immersive without having to try to recreate the world in which we walk and the stores and the streets, and call that a virtual world, okay? So I think that technology will evolve towards it being more immediate and it being lower impact. For example, now, at present, if I want to do useful work on a computer, I really have to sit down at a keyboard and display. I cannot do useful work at the level I want to do it and with the productivity I want on a tablet or on a phone. I can't do that. My wife tries to do everything from her phone, and she'll be sitting in her bed trying to read her email, and she says, I can't read this. And I said, well, do it on your computer. And she tries to print it, and it prints in some weird way. And I say, well, print it from your computer. It works when you do it from your computer, not when you do it from your phone. Okay? So I can't do productive work without a big screen and a keyboard and a mouse and so forth. But someday that'll be all built in. The screen will be built into my glasses and project out in front of me and be as big as you want, okay? The keyboard may be physical or not, but I'll be able to talk to it. Maybe I'll be able to look and say, contacts, bring them out here, look up Steve Jobs or Steve Wozniak, and I have like 5 phone numbers for Steve Wozniak. So saying, give me the phone number of Steve Wozniak doesn't help me. I can say it in my voice, show me the contacts for Steve Wozniak, but to pick the phone number I want, I still need to scan down and use my finger. So I think we're going to evolve towards that kind of multimodal, immediate, built-in, you carry it with you, technology and user interface and user experience.
See, that's what I think the magic of Apple is, Bill.
Yeah.
You worked on the user interface and the UX a lot. Mm-hmm. That's your stock and trade.
Yeah.
What I think Bill's referring to is the UX is going to continue to evolve rapidly.
Yeah.
And until I can actually, in a multimodal environment, get exactly access to what I want to have, we still have a long way to go until you realize that. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, go ahead.
Well, and then kind of my take, when I and we interviewed Ted Hoff and Federico Fegna, and I forgot the last Japanese designer of the 4004, which was introduced in first 4-bit microprocessor. TI had built one, Mode had built one. But Ted Hoff was really unique, and there really is a thread here in terms of system level thinking. He was a computer scientist. He was not a double E. And so they were designing the 4004, which was a gaggle of parts. I think it was like 4 parts plus some memory. And he goes, hey, look, these are going to be worthless unless we have a SDK, system design kit, unless we have an SDK and compilers. We're not going to have anything useful. So that idea of a system level approach, again, an early example of a platform approach, right? And you can see the evolution of this, right? And Apple takes, okay, yeah, of course we got to have a bag of parts, got to have a development kit, got to have compilers, right? And we're going to design some marvelous products, you know, the Apple I, the Apple II, the Mac, blah, blah, you know, et cetera. I think we're moving into a new phase here, because the processing power, I think we've hit the knee in the curve. You know, as much as people talk about Moore's law as being dead, it's not really dead, it's evolving in a lot of different ways. And it's going to evolve in terms of multi-level packaging with multiple CPUs in the same tile, like the learning tile in my Tesla is a gaggle of processors, right? And memory and I/O interface and things like that. Right, you're going to see an evolution as a bridge into quantum computing. You're going to see photonics as a step towards accelerating, you know, I/O, which will accelerate AI. But if you look at where we're at today, you know, with AI and the other three, what Mustafa Suleyman, the CEO of Microsoft AI calls the 4 omni-use foundational technologies. It starts with AI and the various forms that we talk about AI, synthetic biology, think CRISPR, right? Robotics, and then quantum computing, particular room temperature, quantum, right? Because what you really need to get to, I think, to get it, you know, quantum to be really useful in terms of solving real problems. That is, I mean, I think we're entering into personally, I think we're headed into the Wild West again. You know, classically, as Andy Grove would talk about, we have gone from the knee of the curve and we are now at an inflection point, because these 4 technologies are, you know, they are different than what they used to be for us growing up in Silicon Valley. And what's different about them, fundamentally, and this is Mustafa Suleyman's view, not my view, is they cross-pollinate with each other. They are their own vertical platform stacks, right? And they can be used for good things, and they can be used for bad things, right? So think about CRISPR, right? And the development environments are very cheap. So a CRISPR development environment is about $10,000 to $15,000. About as of 10 years ago, it's cheaper now. So if I was a master's degree student at Stanford in biology, I could buy one of these labs, put it in my dorm room, and I could decide, well, do I want to create a cure for ALS or sickle cell anemia? Or do I want to design weaponized smallpox for which there is no antidote, right? That's the world that we're beginning to enter into. And with these technologies, I don't think as a valley, as a country, as a world, or as a species, we've really kind of thought through what both the intended, I think we have a good idea what the intended consequences are. I don't think we have a clue about the unintended. And that is what is, when I think about my journey through Silicon Valley, you know, and go back to the comment about Gordon Moore, the only thing I think I could use a PC for is my wife Betty can organize recipes. I don't think anybody knows, right? And this is happening at a pace. You know, I'm used to, short design cycles, right? And, you know, I'm a business type, go-to-market, sales type, marketing type guy. The design cycles are becoming shorter and shorter and shorter, and the technology is going faster and faster and faster. And those 4 technologies I gave you, a good chunk of them are being developed here. Right, you know, think of NVIDIA. NVIDIA took the platform approach. That's what CUDA is. CUDA, you could wind it back to the 4004 and look what Jensen's doing today. CUDA is the same approach that Ted and Federico came up with. I asked a pretty senior guy from NVIDIA that just recently retired last year. I asked my friend Lee Hirsch, I go, Lee, is that what Jensen did with CUDA? And he goes, absolutely. We're going to build NVIDIA's building a platform because we, at the end of the day, believe our real competitors are Gemini and Anthropic, you know, and OpenAI. And this is going at a speed that I don't think any of us fully have wrapped our heads around. The technology is moving faster than our ability to understand it and adapt to it.
Now I want to expand on something that James mentioned sort of in passing here. He talked about how as the price of CRISPR reduces, it enables smaller and smaller groups, including individuals in their homes, to buy the technology and to follow their dream of solving a problem with the affordable CRISPR technology. That's the same thing that Apple has been doing with its technology, is saying we made it possible, with the Apple I, we made it possible for technologists to have their own computer. With the Apple II, we made it possible for consumers, homeowners, to have their own computer. With the Macintosh, we made it possible for a lot of people to get meaningful work done with their computer. With products like HyperCard, we made it possible for people to build their own software, to follow their dreams. There was game software built, there was reference software built, there was real estate software built. Individuals could say, I now have the tools to follow my dream, to build what I want, to meet my objectives. So as technology develops to put products on the market that enable people to do things, people start doing things. And then and each successive level of product enables more and more. You can now do desktop video editing. You can now have AI do the editing for you. There was a time when you had to buy $100,000 video editing suites if you wanted to put together a video, and then $50,000 editing suites, and then $10,000 editing suites, and then a $2,000 Apple computer with a $100 piece of software. And then that really opened up the floodgates for people to make all the videos, some well, some poorly, but now we have video, YouTube and everything, okay? That's made possible by having technology that is affordable and usable and has the utility to do what people want, so they can do whatever they want, whether it's for good or for evil, whether it's skillful or not, okay?
Bill, James, if you were 18 again, would you even recognize the current area of Silicon Valley?
Recognize it relative to when I was 5 years old, and it was all two-lane roads with dirt and orchards all around it? No, it's an entirely different world.
Yeah, it's so different, and it's so crowded for me relative. Yeah, and I actually, having lived in it my whole life, I'm actually getting kind of tired. Mm-hmm. Right, because because of the pace that we live at here, and because I'm still involved with tech, I'm president of the Intel Alumni Network, I'm still involved with technology, it's a little exhausting. And I absolutely don't recognize this place. One of the biggest shifts is the really tight connection, I think, now between Silicon Valley and south of the border, right? The whole, Mexico and South America, and most importantly, Asia. Right, Asia is such a huge. I remember when Asian engineers, mostly Taiwanese and Indians, began showing up, and it was about the mid-'70s. You began to see a trickle. Right now, I remember going to Milpitas. Right, and when I was a kid, in 237, Highway 237 was a two-lane highway with 6 stoplights. Right, and at every stoplight there were farm stands, and we would go buy. This was an early form of a farmer's market, right? And people used to put bumper stickers on their car that says, "Where the hell is Milpitas?" It was a joke, right? And if you want to eat the best Asian food, and your wife Michelle knows as well, Milpitas, Fremont, and North San Jose, and for Indian food, Sunnyvale, for Korean food, Santa Clara, the influence of Asia writ large is, I think, one of the biggest changes I've seen, and I think it really truly is a change for the better, because we want all the best talent in the world. I want you working on our technology and business problems. I don't want you working for anybody else, right? And I think that the fact that the Silicon Valley is, it wasn't as accepting as when I was a kid, because most of us were sons and daughters of white middle-class engineers. That's just the way it was. I mean, we weren't doing it to be mean or anything else. We did it because we were racist. It's just the way it was, right? But then it shifted. And so kind of Silicon Valley has gone from this place where you and I used to run around the orchards shooting each other with wrist rockets, right?
Or pea shooters.
Or pea shooters. I personally like the trash can lids and the dirt club wars. Those are because we got really dirty playing with those. That's, I absolutely don't recognize it. Right, and I, other than being a little tired, I still love the fact that I get great Asian food anywhere I want now, because I travel a lot in Asia over my 40 years in tech.
About 26 years ago, in 1998, my wife and I and our 2 little kids, we escaped from Silicon Valley. We felt the pace of life, the franticness, the first freeway shootings in Fremont area or San Jose. We said, this isn't the environment we want to live in anymore. And so we ended up moving to Albuquerque. And then every 5 years or so, I would come back to visit with my mom or to work for clients and so forth. And every time I came back, it was different. So even in 26 years, I've seen a huge difference. And I remember what a shock I had. We had grown up in this tract of houses that was built for Lockheed engineers, and gradually everything around us for miles around became suburban houses, streets and sidewalks and everything. That was very fine. It was cool. But right around the corner, there was this one little 1/8-acre plot that had the original ranch house from the orchards. And I remember what a shock it was when I came back and the house was gone, replaced by a couple of townhomes.
Yeah, that is a huge impact, because Bill grew up in an Eichler home,
Yes.
right? Which is now most of the cities around here in the South Bay trying to preserve those as architectural marvels. I just had the standard middle class rambling ranch home, 1,250 square feet. It's a mile and a half here from CHM up Grant Road, and because of largely the Google effect, it's now over $3 million. We bought it for $50,000.
Yeah.
I sold it for $800,000 to help divorce my dad from his second wife. Yeah. And I absolutely don't that's part of it also. I don't recognize Silicon Valley anymore. But I think we're doing Back to the Future.
When I was 5 years old, my parents moved into the Eichler in Sunnyvale, and I remember that he paid something like $50,000 for it. And that was, I guess, 1959 or something.
Yeah, we moved to 65. We moved in Fordham Way in 65.
Yeah. And so years later, when I was maybe 30 or so, I wanted to buy my first house. And I thought, oh, great. Well, I'm sure prices will have gone up. Maybe it'll be $100,000. Maybe it's doubled. But no, I had to pay like $200,000 for a house. No, it was $150,000 for a house. And then when I sold it later, I sold it for almost $250,000, and it was just a little house. It was an old house, at the end of a cul-de-sac and stuff. And I say, where did these prices come from? Yeah, and now, if I see a listing for it, it's like $500,000, and it's still just a little old house at the end of a cul-de-sac. So that's another huge change with Silicon Valley. I don't see how anyone can afford to live here anymore, and I understand a lot of people, can't, even the ones who are living here.
It's definitely a challenge, but
we never had people sleeping in cars and then working a day job at a technology company.
Yeah, and that's, by the way, that's part of the unconsciousness, I think, of Silicon Valley that's very negative, right? I mean, teachers, policemen, and I'm not a liberal person. I'm pretty libertarian Silicon Valley type guy, right? It's unconscionable to me that people have to live in RVs. In Mountain View, you see the parks, and it's just, my first home, I bought downtown San Jose in what would be politely called a transitional neighborhood. To this day, I bought it in '87. It is still a transitional neighborhood. I bought it for $117,000, and my ex-wife sold it for almost $1 million about 5 years ago.
Wow.
I bought my house up in the East Foothills for $289,000. It is now worth about $2 million. And so that there's some things I think we need to do if we're going to keep Silicon Valley vibrant and growing. And I do think we're back to the future. I mean, since '95, hardware, particularly semiconductors, but even hardware, was no longer cool. Silicon and hardware is becoming cool again because it's core to the build out of all different versions of AI, right?
Well, to wrap things up, and maybe you want to talk about AI and that, or just anything, what advice do you give the next generation of engineers here in Silicon Valley?
Well, let me take that first stab at it. I love this quote from Jensen Huang. I heard it a couple months ago. And what he called AI was the revenge of the English major. Right? And this kind of fits, I think, better into Apple's culture, than certainly into Intel's culture or highly engineering-oriented environments, in that technology is becoming more and more user-friendly, and it's more about truly understanding use cases and workflows. So if I were a young person, again, I would advise them to go get a good technical grounding in the next wave of technology, the four that I mentioned. AI, pick one, pick three, pick two, I don't care. Start with AI. Become fluent in the use cases and the workflows, because that's one problem that young people have, right? When you have the kinds of long careers that Bill and I have had, I have forgotten more about sales and marketing than any new college grad can possibly know. Bill has forgotten more about UX design and writing elegant software than new college grads can possibly know. Right, so getting that initial experience and understanding where this technology is headed, and to me, AI is all about content. It's content creation, at least this iteration. AGI is different, I'll grant you that. It is content creation, analysis, and management, right? And with that, then it's about use cases and workflows, right? Particularly in business. And that is what I would encourage young people to do. So go get the technical education, but understand this is about, and this goes back to the core of Apple's culture, is how do you use this shit anyway, right? And I'll hand it over to Bill.
I have no idea what advice to give the next generation of engineers.
That's a good answer.
But I can answer a different question that you haven't even asked.
Do the pivot, Bill.
Do the pivot. Yes,
do the pivot.
Yeah, this is one of my strategies in life, is if I don't know the answer to a question that's been asked, answer a question I do know. Okay, give me that.
Bill, what question should I ask you?
Well done, John.
So, I have seen a lot of disruptive technologies that came on the market or came into the world, shook things up and made a difference, but while things were being shaken up, no one could really predict where they would end up. Okay? So the development of the integrated circuit was one of those. Development of the microprocessor was one of those. The development of the consumer operating system, like the Apple II operating system and then the Macintosh operating system. The development of desktop publishing. We thought that it was thought that if everyone could make their own publications, menus, business cards, flyers, reports, and so forth, word processing documents, that they would blow the profession away. And to a large extent, people went with amateurs to create their printed works. And it was a hard time economically for a lot of the pros. And then the people for whom quality and publication mattered, they went back to the pros, who were by that time using the computers to do it. Okay? So desktop publishing was one of those changes. The laser printer in a consumer model was one of those changes. The Macintosh operating system and that style of interaction was one of those changes. Networking, which grew from nothing to now everyone's got networking. Wireless networking was one of those changes. The internet was one of those changes. The World Wide Web on the internet was one of those changes. Email was one of those changes. And now AI is one of those changes. AI is destabilizing so much stuff, there's so much chaos, and there's so much opportunity, and there's so much magic in the air, so much stuff to dream about. Okay? So I would just say that that's the latest in this long chain of new things that have emerged that have shaken things up and made changes in the world.
Yeah, one last comment though, I can't resist, and I promise to hand it back to you. What strikes me also, and I forgot what I was listening to. I was listening to Prof G Markets with Ed Elson and Scott Galloway, who I listen to regularly, and that one of the guys that they had on said, you know, I know everyone's terrified about losing their jobs, particularly young people, but et cetera, et cetera. And he goes, the last time I checked, even if AI can solve a lot of problems, human beings have always found other problems that we want to solve, right? So, I mean, if you were a buggy whip maker, right, back in the day when buggies were important, and you saw, you know, a car, you were terrified. But with the invention of the car, the buggy whip maker may have gone out of business, but the creation of the car created all sorts of other, again, it goes back to the use cases and workflows, right? Or usability. How is the technology used? I don't think we're going to run out of problems.
No.
Now, we may buy ourselves some more time, or we may end up with a 4-day work week or something like that because productivity is so high. But I don't, you know, until we become, you know, an interplanetary species and we've solved all climate change and we've done, there are going to be plenty of problems to solve. You just haven't seen them yet because the technology is changing in such a way that you really, at the end of the day, Bill said something very important. If you think you can predict what this is, what's going to happen, you're being foolish. You can't. You can only do what we did when we were kids, is get together with groups of people, share ideas, you know, challenge, you know, oh, you think that's the problem? No, I think this is the problem, right? There will still always be those problems to solve. They existed when we were kids just growing up here in the Valley in the 60s and the 70s. There are going to be more problems as AI evolves.
Another thing is that science leads to technology, technology leads to culture. Okay? Science, our understanding of how the world works, allows us to solve problems by building artifacts that use that understanding, and that becomes the technology. And then when you adopt a technology, it changes your life. Okay? If you change from a horse and buggy, you no longer have horse poop on the streets, but you do have pollution in the air. You know, you now have to, and you no longer have to feed your horse when it's at home. You now have to stop every now and then at a gas station. Okay, as examples of how your pattern of usage changes. You know, if you change from a manual hammer to build a house to an electrically operated hammer or nailer, a power nailer, you have to buy the nails that are already made from the manufacturer. You have to buy the batteries, or you have to have the power source. You have to have it repaired. It changes the pattern of your life, and it changes the economics of your life and of the world around you, and the supply chain and the infrastructure around you and the people you deal with. And then the patterns of society change. It changes culture. Okay? And so I see that as a never-ending thing. We learn more, we build more solutions to problems, and in using those solutions, we change the pattern of our lives.